We've heard a little bit about where we've been, where we need to go, and even some ways of how we get there. Our next phase of this session will be a panel where we'll get to hear our speakers speak together. We'll add to the panel. And I want to introduce the moderator of the panel, Gary Cunningham. Gary here's another one of those nice titles. Gary is the Vice President of Programs, Chief Program Officer at the Northwest Area Foundation. He's also a member of the Met Council and currently chairing the Community Development Committee. But I also know Gary to have demonstrated great leadership in other areas as well, including government, health and wellness, community building, and now philanthropy. A good friend and associate, Gary. I'm going to ask the panel to come up, take a seat. I'm going to introduce Peter McLaughlin. Wow, what a group. Now, you heard the facts. You've heard some ideas about those facts, about what we could do. And now we're going to have a conversation with all of you about that. And the new person that is on the panel is a good friend, somebody I go back many years with, Peter McLaughlin. Peter is a Hennepin County Commissioner, and he is also on the policy committee or the policy board of the Corridors of Opportunity, among many other titles. I think many of you in this room know Peter and his great work over the years. So I'm going to take a seat, and we're going to get into a conversation. And we're going to do this, these issues of race and equity are, as someone said earlier, difficult to talk about. There's some difficult conversations, but I want to make it easy for everybody to say, you're held harmless for anything you say in the next few minutes. Before I begin, I did want to introduce the president of the Northwest Area Foundation. If he's still here, I don't see him. Kevin Walker, who has been just stellar. Good friend and somebody that really is supportive of addressing issues for low-income people and populations throughout the country, but in our 8 states. That was my commercial, too. The question I want to pose is, I get the opportunity to be in other places in Portland, Seattle, and, all over the country. And one of the things I see is when some of these systems, transit systems that have been put in place have done great things for those places. But I also see that low-income people, particularly and middle-income people, working people, end up being moved, end up in South King County or in North Portland, and communities that were there no longer exist. And so there's great promise with the changes that we're seeing with the Central Corridor going through the Twin Cities. But there's also issue of dislocation, isolation, and a continuation of ghettoization that has occurred over time. And I'd just like to ask folks about, here we are in the Twin Cities about to embark on our framework, our regional framework, for how we will do planning for the next 10 years. The Metropolitan Council will be making decisions with input of local governments around these issues. What type of advice, given what I've just talked about, or what type of concrete things that we could do as we do this planning? And I know that's a hard question, but it's a question that I think is relevant, because if, in fact, we continue to move people out and et cetera, we won't achieve the kind of prosperity that we all, I think, want to see. So I'll start with Peter.
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to be here, and great to see this big crowd. it's been my experience, actually, that this issue has been attracting people on a very regular basis. I think people see it as an opportunity to really change how we're moving forward. I think what we're going to face here, one, I think as you do your planning, the power of infrastructure investment shouldn't be underestimated. I think you've got to put that right out front. I sometimes call myself an infrastructural determinist. And in fact, in academic settings at least, and it is, the power of infrastructure, I think, has been demonstrated. If you think about the past era, it was about freeways, setting the table for land development and opportunity, coupled with housing policy and other things. And I think what I've tried to articulate is that we're trying to create an alternative to that model, what I call the Levittown model, an improved model that uses infrastructure investment, gets rid of the restrictive covenants that went along with Levittown and that was practiced here, and you can actually create not dispersal and not trying to wall off opportunity, but in fact you're trying to create inclusion, and you do it explicitly with your investment in infrastructure tied to these other policies. And I think we ought to be thinking big about a different model for a pattern of development that is based on opportunity for everyone, not exclusion of people or separation of people. That, to me, would be the inspirational model that the council and others should try to pursue. And that's what we're trying to do with corridors of opportunity. And the power of this infrastructure investment, if you're intentional about equity and opportunity, I think is huge. And we have, on my optimistic days, I think we have a chance to really change the pattern of development and the pattern of opportunity in the country if we lead with it.
Angela.
I agree that you can use infrastructure in inspiring ways. In 2007, PolicyLink launched the PolicyLink Center for Infrastructure Equity because we understood that so many people who are being left behind in this country live in places that are being left behind, and infrastructure investments can make a huge difference. If you were convinced by the conversation that we just had here at the podium, and you are now committed to making sure that you lead with equity. If you're focused on this issue of transportation, you need to step back and ask, what are the equity requirements? What is it that the communities need, and what do the individuals need that are being left behind? What do they need in terms of entrepreneurial advancement? What do they need in terms of health? What do they need in terms of access to opportunity throughout the region? What do they need in terms of education and job opportunity? And in order to answer those questions, you're going to have to ask the people who are being left behind, who are at risk of being left behind, to come in and guide that conversation, which means you have to flip it on its head. You have to start with the people you want to see advance. You have to ask what they need. You have to analyze that. And then you have to ask, and how do we use our investment in a light rail system to be able to achieve those things? If you go at it that way, you'll do just fine. And there's really no other way to do it. And the good news is, if you go about it that way, everybody will be just fine. Not just the ones who are being left behind, but the entire region.
John, do you want to?
Yeah. So first of all, I said what Angela and Peter said. So, but secondly, two things I want to lift up in particular. So I think literally what Peter and Angela said, I think is right, and the data we heard earlier, I think all that's right. So why aren't we doing it? Mm-hmm. I mean, the reality is, for decades, if not centuries, we've actually used infrastructure, we've used policy to actually separate people. And this is using policy to actually segregate people from opportunity. That's what segregation is. We sort of think of segregation just separating people by race. It's actually segregating people from opportunity. It's distributing opportunity in a certain way. Now, we've done that for a long time. We're good at it. And the question is, why have we done it? And why would we stop doing it? And so, why aren't people embarrassed, as Angela suggested? And I think one of the reasons they're not embarrassed is because we have a story about race in America. Mm-hmm. And the story justifies and actually motivates us not to actually come together, but to continue the separation. And so I think part of the things that have to put on the table is the stories we tell ourselves, the stories that we practice, the stories about them people, and to have a real conversation about that. I mean, as long as we really, and there's really some powerful data around this, the sprawl and white flight, sprawl is actually a dressed up version of white flight. In the 50s and 60s, we called it white flight, and then it's like, that's not polite. We'll call it sprawl. We don't want to, make anybody feel uncomfortable. And it's not just white flight. It's actually even middle class flight. I mean, so the thing is, unless we actually, and the people who have the fewest resources, literally get left behind because they can't move to opportunity. And then when opportunity moves to them, as Gary suggested, it's like, this is a great place to live. Where are you going?
Yeah.
Whether it's Harlem, whether it's Chicago. So again, even when opportunity comes to the place where people are, who are marginalized, we oftentimes develop practices and policies that basically say they have to leave. Not only do they have to leave their neighborhoods and their communities, but they land in a new place where there's not opportunity. So it's a double injury. You're kicked out, and you once again land in a place where there's not opportunity. So I think that now, if we're going to change that practice, and I think we can and we should, we also have to have a conversation as to why, about our attitudes, about our story, and be able to tell a different story. So, for example, the data on prisons, we know, for example, that if you say blacks are 7 to 8 times more likely to go to prison as whites, the backstory for a lot of people is that, yeah, they're criminals. They're dangerous. If we say that Latinos are more likely to drop out of school, we know the backstory is, yeah, they don't care about school, they're stupid. And so until we can interrupt those stories and tell different stories, even the data doesn't actually do the work we want it to do, because we have a way of making sense of it that not only leaves us still doing that practice, but also leaves us not embarrassed.
Nakima, do you want to comment on my question?
Well, I think everything that's been said was right on point, and I agree wholeheartedly. For almost a year, I was part of a group called the Central Corridor Community Agreements Coordinating Council. Did I get it right? I know there are some people here who are part of that group. What was amazing about the group is that it was an amalgamation of people in business, community members, government leaders, all gathered around this issue of corridors of opportunity, looking at the impacts of the Central Corridor on the communities that will be affected. And what I heard throughout that process of being the facilitator for that group was that there are still a number of unresolved issues, and there's still an opportunity to correct some of the things that are negatively. Did I set off
I think it's the computer back here.
Oh, okay. But I believe that there's. Oh, okay.
Not I.
No.
Back there.
Oh, here's my phone.
Our moderator.
But there's still an opportunity to correct some of the mistakes that have been made, where many of the representatives from these groups were not involved in the initial planning of the Central Corridor, and they are crying out for help. So, for example, the business owners who are not going to be able to afford to remain in that area, and the impacts that that's going to have on employees of those businesses, and also people in the community who do not have access to transportation, who walk to those businesses. Those are issues that are still ongoing. You also have people who were affected by the old Rondo neighborhood, being split in half by the freeway, and still feeling the pains of that, not feeling that amends have been made, and having to relive that trauma through what's happening right now with the Central Corridor. So I think that this is a prime opportunity for change to happen, but we're going to have to be deliberate in terms of listening to the voices of the people who are feeling oppressed, or who are concerned that they'll get railroaded, in the process, to really affect change on a broader level. It is going to take, again, the stakeholders involved to come around the table, talk about this issue, and also to put our money where our mouths are in terms of making sure that there are resources available, not just, chump change, but really tangible resources that are really going to help the people feel as though they've been a part of this process of transformation.
I wanted to clap myself, but I'm supposed to be neutral up here.
Oh, no.
I'm going to open up the floor. There's 2 mics that are going to roll. Now, I just want to say, we are beginning a conversation here today. And clearly, there's going to be difference of opinion about how we approach these issues. And I certainly want people that have differences of opinion, different than opinions that you're hearing, to speak up. And the reason for that is that, one, we live in a civil place, right? We need to have civil dialogue around these issues to get somewhere. If we can't have that civil dialogue, then people don't express their points of view, and then we move forward in a way that we're not bringing everyone with us, or we don't reach, they're trying to reach a compromise at the state. But we don't reach a compromise that's necessary for us to move our community forward together. So, I really want to have an open dialogue about all kinds of questions that are being raised here, so that as we think about these issues and make policy around them, that we really listen to the voice of the community that's out here. So, Russ, here we got our first question. Please.
Sherry Pugh. And I have sort of a statement and a question for advice. We have 2 of our communities of color which are under significant challenges of opportunity, the Central Corridor, which was mentioned, but also having worked in North Minneapolis, what has happened over the last 15 years is that community went through the devastation of displacement because of overconcentration of poverty, the removal of low-income housing units. Then it went through the foreclosure quest, which wiped out all the new homeowners of people of low income, and now a tornado. And so as we talk about, Angela, as you talked about, where is the embarrassment, and how do we take the opportunity that has already had a lot of people flee from the community because of the disaster, really get their opportunity to come back?
Do you want to respond?
Please.
I think that we've learned a lot about how important it is to make that coming back a priority. The 5-6 years of work that has been done in New Orleans, I think, shows us exactly what happens when you don't make that a priority and have a plan for moving on it right away. Here, 6 years later, you still have so many people who haven't been able to return home. I do think that it gets right back to what John was saying, though, about the story that we tell ourselves, because this is not an absence of strategies. We know what the strategies are. We can imagine what the strategies are. Anytime that you hear something that's happened to low-income people of color, if you just substitute white people for it, you would see what the strategies are right away. Think what was happening. It's true, right? Think what would happen if white youth were getting locked up at the rate that black youth are. We'd have all kind of strategies dealing with that. Think what would happen if in your most affluent white community people got displaced because of a tornado. We'd have all kinds of strategies. This is not because of the absence of strategies. It's an absence of commitment. And the absence of commitment either is something that people are mean and they say, I just don't care about those people, or people have a story. And more than likely, they have a story. One of the things that I read recently in a book that I read about voodoo was it was a long discussion about myth. And I remember this sentence because it was so powerful for me. That myth is truths of the mind made manifest in the fiction of matter. Okay? So that we have these myths that we have developed, and then we create a fiction about the world as it exists and act as if it's real. So the answer to your question is we have all kinds of strategies that you can use for every one of those, but you have to have a commitment to solving the problem, solving it effectively in a way that leaves people with dignity and is sustainable, and we know how to do that.
All right. We have a question up here.
Thank you. I wrote my question down. If no amount of qualitative or quantitative data about racial disparities and correlation with structural racism, structural inequities, if nothing will convince conservatives or moderate policymakers and their constituents to wake up and commit to social and economic justice for poor people of color, then how can progressives overcome those oppositional forces?
All right. Who wants to take that question?
Well, I guess I'll start, and I'll say, first of all, many of you may know I was part of a group, and a number of you are in the room, part of that group of the Structural Racism Caucus, and now I refer to it as structural racialization, because I think racism implies conscious intent, and I think what's actually happening oftentimes is not conscious intent, but sometimes racial anxiety, but even sometimes without racial anxiety, racial effects. And so when we focus on racism, the goal is oftentimes to stop a person from being racist, right? When we focus on structural racialization, I think the goal should be to produce policies and structures that don't have negative racial outcomes. So we should have racial impact statements or equity impact statements. We should look at actually what's happening to people. And even if no one intended for it to happen, we should be concerned about it. So that's one. The other thing is that America, we're in this funny place. And, the maps that Angela showed us, I think is really important. But there's actually a conscious story and an unconscious story, a conscious expression or understanding of that and unconscious. And I want to suggest two things. One, the unconscious actually is much more important. Some of you heard me use this data. At any given time, we process 11 million bits of information at a time. And only, at best, 40 of that 11 million is conscious. What's the work that's being done, and the unconscious is a much better predictor of the policies, of our practice, and of our understanding. So the reason I say that then is that, and the unconscious is actually multifaceted. It's not consistent. It doesn't even care about data. What it likes is stories. What it likes is metaphors. What it likes is smells. And so I'll give you just one concrete example. And advertisers figured this out a long time ago. You want to sell a tire? You could tell people, this tire has so many treads, this tire is, will run so many miles, this tire. Or you put a beautiful woman with boots on. It goes way up. There's an association. It doesn't make sense. What is that? What is those? And interesting. It's not just a beautiful woman. You need the boots.
Interesting.
So the boots is doing some work. I don't know what they're doing.
I don't know either.
So my point is that the stories we tell around race, the stories not just about facts and figures, they're important, but the stories to activate the better angels. The stories, because we both want to be connected and we're afraid of being connected. And which of those actually happen depends on the larger setting. And this is what leadership can do. It can actually increase our anxiety or it can dampen it. And for some people, when they see the maps that Angela showed, for some people, they go, Mm-hmm. So all, it's like, let's build a wall. All these people coming to the country, we got to do something. Let's take the country back.
Uh-oh.
From whom? And so literally people are playing on racial anxiety. They know that we're going through this huge change and we're having trouble making sense of it. And our leaders then actually can up the anxiety or up the hope. So our job then is to create hope where we're all in it together. Some people are saying we're not in it together. You need to build a wall. You need to have your gated community. You need to move further out to the suburbs. You need to use infrastructure to separate us. And so the stories we tell, and I think most Americans are in that middle where they could go either way. And which way they go will depend on who dominates the narrative and if we do it smart. And I'll end just by saying, too long, people of our persuasion, many people of our persuasion, think you do it by facts and figure. People don't care whether or not Obama have a birth certificate. What they're really saying is he's not one of us. There's a different message. And so when he shows the birth certificate, we think those stupid people, they don't realize that he has a birth certificate. That's not what they're really saying. It's a different message. And we have to be able to talk to the unconscious in a much more sophisticated way.
Peter?
The notion of stories, I think, is important. And one of the triumphal stories in this country over the last 25 years has been the marketplace. The marketplace has the right answers. That is the story. And what it does is it allows people say, oh, that's what the marketplace decided. And the invisible hand, that's rational. It's not anybody trying to stack the deck. And so then that allows things that happen behind the marketplace, the effects of it, the racialization of how the economy moves, people can forgive themselves for that, and policy leaders forgive themselves because, well, the market is deciding this. And you've got these infrastructure investments, they attract private capital. I mean, if you put in a light rail line, it is an incredibly powerful force. It will attract private capital. And so I think what we're going to have to be, I'm going to go back to this question of the intentionality. There is an opportunity here with this ability to attract capital, but we're going to need to be intentional about how we do it and make sure that, in fact, people and businesses who are in place already are part of the new, improved community with more disposable income that actually has a grocery store and has a drugstore and other amenities and parks and the like in those communities that emerge after the private capital is attracted by virtue of this infrastructure investment. That, to me, there's this dance we have to do with the marketplace. And the marketplace doesn't work just all by itself. It never did. I mean, the suburbanization of America was not done with just straight marketplace. There were all sorts of policies and strategies that supported that. We now have a chance. We have a chance to actually ride the wave that the energy costs represent, the need for transit investment, that there we have a chance, instead of fighting the economic forces that were pushing sprawl, we can actually be riding the wave of forces that actually allows for more concentration in urban areas and along these corridors if we're smart about it. And that's how I think we have to change it. We have to be willing to dance with the forces of the marketplace, which are incredibly powerful. And if you're not strong as a neighborhood or a community, they'll roll over you. But if you get organized to begin with, as a neighborhood, around your station, and you have a vision for your station and what you want to happen how that station will function in your community, then when the private developers show up and say, we want to build this, you can say, well, that's nice, but we want to make sure this, and this happens in conjunction with your development, whether it be affordable housing, access to parks, and the like. So you've got to build that strength in the community and the vision, and then you can do the dance with the marketplace. And that's a powerful, powerful story if you can do that dance with the marketplace.
Have you seen that work?
Wait. We're not going to get out of control here. I'm going to call on this person up here, and then we'll get back to you, okay?
Thank you. Hello, my name is Veronica Burt. I'm with a project called Just Equity, and also the cultural organizer and policy advocate with the Preserve and Benefit Historic Rondo Committee. And my question and comment to the panel is, I really appreciate, Mr. Powell, how you've very clearly talked about how we are situated very differently throughout the structure of opportunity, and that some of us need stairs, some need elevators, and some need escalators. I think in a lot of work that we've been doing around the Central Corridor has been trying to emphasize that, especially when we've talked about specifically the condition of the Rondo community and the cumulative related impacts over time that has situated that historic African American community very differently. And trying very hard to press upon policymakers how to, with intentionality, as the commissioner is saying, to apply opportunities relative to this investment based on that understanding of being situated differently and having cumulative impacts. And so, for example, we've done a lot of organizing. We've helped to get some additional stations along that corridor. And now I'm happy to say, for example, the Victoria Station is being dedicated to the Rondo community, thanks to pressures that folks have been applying. But now still it's about that intentionality. How do we get our community members to further benefit and get jobs out of the deal? How do we get our community to have economic development around that station to help restore our community's economic engine, to address the cumulative impact when we lost our economic engine because of the freeway? And so again, it's intentionality after intentionality. So my question to you is, given that fact, describe some real particular policies and outcomes, as the person over here shouted out. You know, when has that happened? You know, give us examples of government creating intentionality in partnership with the community, because we want development this time around to work with and for us and not to us.
All right. Who wants to start, Angela?
There are many examples, and I'm not going to give you examples that are just government examples, because what you want to know is, what does it look like? And then you want to figure out how to align government policy so you can get that more often. I don't know how many of you are following what's happening with the Evergreen Cooperative in Cleveland, Ohio. Hands? Well, here's a good example. That in Cleveland, Ohio, while the majority of the corporations that were there are gone, and the population is way less than half of what it was in its prime, what you have is a situation there where you have some anchor institutions. You have some major hospitals. Case Western is there. And those institutions are spending money all the time. Based on wonderful work that had happened out of the University of Maryland. Ted Howard is the name to know about all of this. Working very closely with the Cleveland Community Foundation, they've created the Evergreen Collaborative, that is a worker-owned business doing the laundry for the hospitals and the university. And many of the people who are working there are not just low-income black people from the Cleveland community. Many of them are returning from having been incarcerated. So here's an example of taking advantage of money that's going to be spent anyway on things that have to happen anyway and dealing with the equity outcome. And the reason to do it is not to get the laundry done. The reason to do it is to achieve equity. And so you use getting the laundry done and anything else you can find to achieve equity. Now, I could give you 20 examples of things happening around the country. I'll just flip over to one, but know that I could easily give you 20 if you gave me 20 minutes. If I could do a minute of an example. The Market Creek Plaza in San Diego. What you have there is an example of a community that's been abandoned. There was no grocery store there. There was heavy poverty. The foundation, working with community, created a destination for this community by getting a grocery store there, getting cultural activities there. There had always been a transit stop, but nobody ever stopped there. Once you had all of this activity, that transit stop became very important, and it was a destination. They anticipated success, so they began to develop housing strategies before this was completely successful. It's another example of doing just what we're talking about. So find the examples first and then ask the question, and how can government policy create more of these examples? That's the work of PolicyLink. That's what we do. Our website is policylink.org. Go on it. We have an equitable development toolkit and more reports and things that you will ever want to read. But they are all about how to lift up what works and put policies in place that allow it to spread.
Let me just add to what Angela just said. And in terms of your question, there literally are examples all across the country. And PolicyLink has been involved in, and Angela and Kerwin. Sometimes we've done some stuff together, as well as others. The point, and Peter made this point, right? It's not that we don't have strategies. The thing is that the market, the way it's structured, some people would say the way it's rigged, it responds to a certain community. It doesn't respond to the other communities unless you are intentional. And when you are intentional in the market, sometimes people say, wait a minute, you're interrupting the market, right? But, you know, when the market's not working for the banks, they change the rules. You know, that's what they do. When the market's not working for us, they say, it's not working. It's the market. What do you expect? And so in that sense, the rules of the market are heavily racialized. I mean, I see Tim Thompson here. I mean, if you think about the credit rules that are being discussed right now in terms of the market, we know if those rules are adopted, they're not rules yet, they're being discussed. And the banks are saying, wait a minute, you adopt this rule, you're going to hurt our flow of capital. But what they're not saying is if you adopt some of these rules, you will lock out poor white, Black, Latino, and Asian community out of the housing market for the next 2 generations. So they're making rules. They're changing the market. Once it's in place, it looks natural. This is just the market doing what the market does. So part of the thing is the intentionality. It's to be very intentional. And I would say, even tell a story. You're not anti-market. You just want the market to work for all of us. And the market we have to make sure it works for all of us. And the last thing I'll say on this is that, and this is actually tricky and important, we are situated differently. And so we do want to advocate not just for the person to have the stairs, but also for the person to have the elevator. But we want to do it in such a way that we're not just talking about the person in the wheelchair. We're talking about all of us. All of us. And sometimes we forget that. And so sometimes we think we're only talking about the Black community. Mm-hmm. And then people say, well, what about the Latino community? Okay, let's talk about the Latino community. Now, what about, and here in Minnesota, we need to talk about Black community, the Hmong community, the Native American community, and the white community. There's stress in every community. And you have to have a story that's big enough to actually acknowledge that. So even the work of disparities is not good enough because disparity in some ways normalizes the white community. And the white community is doing better than any other community, but in this environment, it is also under stress. And so we have to have a story that allows us to talk about all of our communities. And that's what I try to do with the work around targeted universalism. And really dig deep in terms of our situatedness. We can do that.
And if I could just add, I totally accept when John talks about targeted universalism. I accept it completely, and that's one way to talk about it. The way that we talk about it is equity, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate and prosper. That is a story about everybody. You tell me who's being left behind, and then we need to understand why, and that's the equity agenda. The words are not important. Whether you say targeted universalism, whether you say equity, whatever you say, what we have to embrace is that we have to have a vision for the nation and a way for everybody to be able to achieve that vision. That what we need is a pathway from hope to change. A pathway from hope to change. Hope is a good thing. Change is what we want. And so we've got to have a story that gets us there, and it has to be a story that allows everybody to see themselves in it and feel compelled to make sure that everybody can achieve within it.
So underneath that, there is this issue of people perceiving this as a zero-sum relationship, meaning, that we got X number of resources. If somebody else gets some of those resources for targeted purposes, that means, I might not have mine. You have the issue of, if I lived in a third ring suburb, I moved there for a reason, right? And there's some, even though everything you're saying makes sense, there's this dynamic of zero sum that comes into play around these debates that are going on at the legislature, they're going on here in the Twin Cities. How do you address that mentality within the context of everybody's going to win?
Well, I think that's a really important question. And I think it's a question that we need more time to really unpack, but I'll just say a couple of things. First of all, we're not just talking about redistribution. We're talking about growing. Mm-hmm. And you say there are a limited number of resources. So what are our resources? Our most important resource is us. Mm-hmm. Our most important resource is us. And so if they're a limited number, you want to make sure all of these resources, both in terms of democracy, both in terms of culture, both in terms of the economy, are used. And that's why I tell the story about the race between education and technology. So one could have said, why are we wasting money at the beginning of the 20th century? Why are we wasting money sending women to school? And in fact, that may sound like a stupid thing to say, but that was the dominant fight at the beginning of the 20th century. And sometimes, and some of you may know who know your history, know that in terms of graduate schools, that was a harder fight. It was like, why are you taking that slot from a man and giving it to a woman when you know that all she's going to do is have a baby and stay home, right? So, I mean, now that sounds stupid. It sounds crude. But that was the debate that people were having, and they had to tell a story. And someone had a vision. And after the United States invested in women, which was money, the pie expanded. And literally, by the middle of the 20th century, every major democracy had adopted that model, that you had to invest in women. Beginning of the 20th century, nobody was doing it because it was seen as a zero-sum game. But the pie started growing, and growing fast. That is what people of color represent in the United States today. We're not investing in that population to contribute to the whole. We see investing in that population as taken from the whole. So that's part of it, is to really understand we're talking about investment. We're talking about growing together. And it's very practical examples. I'll give you one that, again, in Cleveland, Angela and I, Policy Link and Current Institute did, and Bob Bullard did a major project. And Angela, I don't know if you followed up with this, but there were fights between the suburb and the city, which was really between blacks and whites. I mean, we didn't say black and white, we said suburb and city, because that sounds nicer than black and white. But it was really between blacks and whites. And the suburb was like, you know, you want our stuff? I mean, you know, you're not getting it. And the black community was like, we want to, you know, we need some of your stuff. And so what we actually got them to agree on was that there would be no redistribution of existing resources in terms of tax base, in terms of bonds, but that they would grow new resources, and those new resources would be distributed in an equitable way. Not equal, because equitable way meant that people were situated differently, so the city might need more on some things than the suburb, and there are some suburbs that needed more, and that this new growth would be distributed in an equitable way 5 years from now. And people say, you mean I don't have to give up anything now? Nothing for 5 years? We can sign on to that. So they all agreed. Within 2 years, they actually strengthened and adopted a tax-based sharing plan. So they actually started sharing not 5 years later, but 2 years later. Because part of it, the working together, they started to actually build relationships. They told a different story about each other. They start to see that the region, if the region was going to grow, it wasn't the city versus the suburb. They need the whole region to grow together. And the mayor, who initially was very hostile to the idea of working with the suburbs, because he felt like every time I worked with the suburbs, they try to take over. They try to control everything. That ain't going to happen on my watch. I mean, he said that. He said, I don't know what this regionalism is. I understand regionalism is where the suburbs come and take over the city. That's what it means to me. And it ain't going to happen in Cleveland while I'm mayor. He is now considered the mayor of the region. Mm-hmm. And he just held a big, and I actually had a conversation with him. I said, this is not about your giving up power. This is about your expanding your base. Your influence is not just the city. Your influence is the whole region. He said, maybe I could get behind that.
I think we're going to have to call it a day.
Really?
I just want. All right. Special dispensation.
Jim, and I'll have to be quick. The answer to your question is what John said. And think of this. What if I told you that a place that was vast had a population that had one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world? That it had a population that had a very low educational achievement rate? A population that was not job ready under any sense of that definition, and a population that was not healthy? What would you think would be the prospects for that place? And you would probably say it's going to really be tough. What I have described to you is California in the 1950s, and that population was white. And California stepped up and created the best educational system, the best healthcare system, and the best workforce, and grew and became the most powerful state in the union. They're not doing it anymore because they're not doing the same thing for a population that is not white. Equity is a superior growth model. It's not about zero sum. It's about how do we grow together, and we do it by investing in equity. Find out all about equity. Equity 2011, a conference that Policy Link is having in Detroit in November.
one more time, you all, for our fine panelists and our moderator. And just to note, the Policy Link Equity Summit, everybody that signed in, we can send out a notice of the date and location and so forth for you. Also just wanted to do, as we close, a couple of closing acknowledgments. Some already in progress. There's a number of organizations that helped to host this. One being the Northwest Area Foundation. We saw Kevin Walker a little earlier. I don't know if he left. And we have our very own Gary Cunningham here. I think Sue Haig from, right here, Metropolitan Council co-hosted. And then the three organizations, the Minnesota Center for Neighborhood, organizing the program of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the university. We have Russ and his organization at the Alliance for Metropolitan Stability, and then Nexus Community Partners. We are hoping to have this be one of a series of discussions of this nature, and want to use the sign-in to keep you in a heads-up kind of position, so as we go forward, we can keep you linked in. And then the last thing I would say is that I'm hoping that today's discussions and the ideas and the insights, the challenges, and the space that's been created is not just viewed as good information, listening, and exchange, that it does actually impact and influence the way we go about our work, whether it's in our own organizations or the way we work with each other across organizations. And that the moment that we're in is a moment that we can't take for granted. The change is happening, and either we're going to be a part of it or it's going to happen to us. And if it happens to us, many of what was described there will be the case. We have a golden opportunity. The corridors of opportunity is a small fraction, a small moment in time, but it is a potential stage for setting forth a future that could be very, very powerful. There's a lot to be done. There's a lot to be undone. And to the degree that we can figure out ways to see forward together, I think there's huge possibilities that's laid out for us. Again, the kind of thinking and the stimulation that our speakers and our panelists provided for us is to move us. Not just to inspire us, but to move us to action together. And so thank you for being here. We will again stay in contact with you. If you can make it, the Policy Link Summit will be great. It's a place where these kind of issues, these kind of challenges and opportunities are discussed across sectors, and where people come to learn new models, new strategies that they take back to their communities to do better work. Thank you.